you. I'm really excited to present here, and I've had the opportunity to catch up on a few sessions, and I know that most of them have dealt with the technical aspects of algorithms and AI and machine learning. And I'm here to extend all of those learnings into a space for employees of any organization. So I'm here to talk about being people first in people analytics. And thank you, Cloris, for the introduction. I am Sreyoshi Bhaduri. I am a people researcher and an engineer. And I currently lead global people research and analytics at McGraw Hill. McGraw Hill is a learning sciences company, and it's a very old publication house as well. And I am in charge of looking at all the employees and the employee data within the organization. So looking at things which will really help, better the employee experience. So things like how people are hired, how people are promoted, how is engagement within the organization, who is getting termed, who is leaving the company, rehires, all of that is under people research. So today I wanted to talk about people research and using AI and ML in people research and analytics. But before we go to that, I wanted to, hear from you, know where you're joining us from. I wanted the session to be more interactive, so feel free to use the chat function and type in, your names or where you're joining us from and what you're looking forward from this session. Any volunteers? Just go into your chat function and enter in where you're joining us from and what you're looking or hoping to learn from this session. I see one in. Okay, so it says chat disabled. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought chat was working. But I see that people have put it under Q&A. So I have people from San Jose, from Los Angeles. That's awesome. From Northern Ireland, Chicago. That is so cool. And we have someone who's an early stage researcher. And I think the chat function seems to be working now. So feel free, if you've not put in yet, to go into the chat function. So I see someone has replied in the chat and says that they're looking forward to seeing how we can improve and learn from company staff data. And that's exactly what we're here to talk about. Someone from Toronto, Jake is from UCLA. That's really cool. So I see that a lot of you are from California and some from out of state, out of the country even. So really cool. And get familiar with the chat function, because I'm really hoping for this session to be more interactive and really get your feedback as we together solve for, looking at how AI and ML can be used in industry, in people research. So with that, the goals for this session, I wanted to start off and just introduce 3 basic goals or takeaways for this session. The first was that at the end of the session, everyone is able to recognize people analytics challenges or even describe them within your organizations, your teams. I see that a lot of you are still in university, and that is fine. You can even describe it for your university teams, for your departments, whichever team, whichever group that you're working with, you're able to really understand what people analytics is, what the scope of people analytics is, And then moving on, we are able to understand the need for inclusive and ethical context-driven best practices. And now that's a lot of words, but we'll come and we'll, decipher what each and every word in that statement means. Finally, we'll be able to, since this is an AI ML forum conference, I want to be able to together explore applications of AI and ML in people analytics problem solving. So within your organizations, your departments, your small groups, teams, whatever we're interested in looking at. So based on these three goals, I have the three sections of this talk. So we'll focus first on, what is people analytics in general. Then we'll look at why is it important to be inclusive and context driven. And then finally, we'll look at how can I best use AI and ML in people analytics. So the first is, what is people analytics? So let's go in and again into our chat or the Q&A, whichever you're comfortable with. Have you heard of people analytics as a term within your organization, in your school? Just have you come across this term, or how do you define people analytics? Any responses? Employee performance management. That's a great answer. Yes, absolutely. It's one of the many ways people analytics could be used is to look at employee performance management. Any others? Has everyone heard of people analytics? So Sean asks, is that for big company with lots of employees? Not necessarily. I think people analytics is usually seen as something that is for big companies with lots of employees, with lots of data. But I'm here to talk about how this is relevant within small teams, how this is relevant within small groups as well. So it's not just for big companies with lots of employees. It can be within any company, within any team, within any group, department, school. And it doesn't have to have lots of employees, just enough that you're interested in getting analytics from or insights from, not always analytics. Musa says customer experience management. And yes, this is absolutely related to customer experience management. In fact, you can think of people analytics in terms of, your internal customers within an organization. So your internal customers are your employees of the organization. So think of employees as important stakeholders, right? So they have enough say in how things can progress within an organization. They have enough stake in, for example, telling you what your outcomes could look like, what your products could look like. So really thinking of customer experience, but for internal customers. So absolutely right. Identifying hard and soft skills. I see Shonan has written something about our company HR departments asks for employees to fill out surveys from time to time. We tabulate that data to make informed decision. Is that people analytics? Yes, absolutely. So that is a part of people analytics. You take data from the employees and use that to make decisions. So that is exactly spot on what people analytics is. So people analytics has several names. You may have heard of it in some form or the other. There is the term people analytics, of course. There's talent analytics, there's workforce analytics, HR analytics, employee performance management, like Musa said. Um, and all of these are similar. So they're related to the employees within the organization, or the process, or the talent, or the human resources aspects of the organization. So all of these are similar, but they're not the same. There is slight difference in the terminology, but essentially they're all doing the same thing. They're looking at employee data and coming up with solutions to help in decision making. So over here, I have two definitions of sorts. So we have Hewell and Bondaruk, who talked about how people analytics is a systematic identification and quantification of the people drivers of business outcomes. So it's interesting how they talk about the terms quantification of the people. So they're thinking more in terms of quantifiable data that they are collecting from employees at an organization. And this is a definition from 2016. So obviously right now with our existing capabilities, people analytics has expanded. It is not just quantification anymore. It can go into different things like sentiment analysis, engagement analysis, all of that, depending on what analytics we're interested in using. I really like the second definition a lot, and Gal Jensen and Stein in 2017 talk about how it's a data-driven approach to managing people at work. That's exactly what it is. It's using data to drive decision making. So people analytics is essentially just using data from the people, making it into insights or analytics, and then using that insights to drive change or to drive better employee experience within an organization. And Hemant asks, so is it an ongoing process? And absolutely, it is. It is an ongoing process. And as we'll discover in later slides, it's a continual process, and it follows all employees through their entire life cycle. So right from when they join to after they've left, and when we're trying to hire them, and when they're within the organization, we're trying to promote them, make sure that they're engaged, make sure that they are not looking to, voluntarily terminate, those kind of things. So definitely an ongoing process. Great questions, and I love that everyone is comfortable with chat and is able to use them. So make sure you type in any questions that you have into the Q&A portion or the chat, whichever you're comfortable with. So people analytics data can be demographic related, engagement related, or interaction related. And this, obviously the data, so Liang says that the chat box is still disabled. Cloris, I'm wondering if that is something we can fix. If not, make sure you go into Q&A. That is fine as well. I know that it's working for some people because I see the chat pop up from some people, but it may not be working for everyone, and that is fine. Just type into Q&A. I'll read out your questions, okay? So like I was saying, people analytics data can be about the demographic. It could be how different people within the organizations are engaged with what they're doing, or what the outcome of their work is. So how, for example, how productive they are, what products they've led, what objectives they've fulfilled, those kind of things related to engagement. And then finally, interactions. So how are people working in teams? How are teams working together within the organization? So what is the interaction between different levels, hierarchies, those kind of things. So you can think of it from an individual level to going on to organizational levels. So it can be the entire data set for all of the organization, the interactions within the organization, but it could also mean demographic related or related to one employee at a given time. So that is really the scope of what people analytics data can be. Now, the task, like with any ML AI task, people analytics tasks can be descriptive, they can be predictive, and then they can be diagnostic. Does anyone have any, do you want to maybe type into chat about examples of either descriptive, predictive, or diagnostic, examples? So someone says, we are working on an international project, which our recruiter is looking for some creative and professional ones. Oh, maybe that is something related to that person's interests anyway. Heyman says, I foresee this will require a lot of initial setup. And what do you mean by initial setup, Heyman? Does anyone have any examples of descriptive, predictive, or diagnostic tasks? Predictive should be really easy. Everyone is working in AI and ML. So can you give me an example?
Term prediction.
I'm sorry, what?
Term prediction.
Term prediction, absolutely. Term prediction is a great one that's so important. I think there was a study that was conducted where people were trying to understand what people analytics is used for, and about 60% of organizations are using people analytics to predict who is going to terminate, who is going to voluntarily leave the organization because it costs so much, to replace a person. So definitely, term prediction is a great one, a great example of predictive analytics. So let's look at a few others. So if we look at predictive and demographic related, combining these two, so combining the data set that is demographic related and then combining a task that is predictive, one example could be, at the current rate, that is for an organization, how many years will it take for senior leadership to comprise at least 70% diversity? And in this case, it could be, for example, racial diversity. It could also be gender diversity, or it could be any other kind of diversity that that organization is trying to work towards as a goal. So this is an example of predictive analytics related to demographic. Similarly, for engagement related, you could also have diagnostic, descriptive, or predictive, and then also for interaction related data sets. So within your teams or organization, or think of even your groups at your universities, for those who are students, what potential do you think people analytics has within your team or organization? And I see Liang has already replied saying talent recommendation. And that's a great one. For example, in hiring, during onboarding, talent recommendation is a great way to use AI or ML to kind of augment your analytics or augment your understanding of the team or team functions, or where your existing team function may be going in the next couple of months. Anyone else? What potential does people analytics have within your team or organization? So Heyman says they have ServiceNow, which is a service desk, which will look for issue and suggest resolution. Absolutely, that's again a great example of using predictive or diagnostic ways of using analytics to serve the employees within the organization. Do you know, Hemant, if they're using any kind of AI or ML in what they do, or is it just more descriptive, or just fixing as the solutions arise? And we can keep coming back to this, but keep thinking about, what potential does people analytics have within your team or organizations? Do you see your team and organization using people analytics a lot? And if not, why? Why do you think it's not necessary or not required? And Hemant, I recall that you had, asked if this is an ongoing process, if people analytics is an ongoing process. And I wanted to highlight the employee life cycle. Over here, you can see how it begins when, right here, when we attract a new employee. Then we go into recruitment or onboarding. And then once the employee has joined in, we have to make sure that the employee is engaged, is productive, is just happy doing what they're doing, and is able to output to the best of their abilities. We want to make sure that we are identifying talent and then promoting talent that requires recognition or deserves recognition. And we are ensuring that everyone within the organization is feeling included, and there is enough retention within teams, even for diverse employees, for example, where usually there is a problem with retaining diverse employees, especially when there's a question of culture fit versus culture add, which in different organizations may be a problem. And finally, when separation, when the employee decides to leave or is termed because of business decisions. So throughout the employee's life cycle, you can see that AI or people analytics is used in all of these steps for through the employee's life cycle and to improve the employee experience. Let's focus on recruitment, and that's the bin that's highlighted here. So Steve Levy from Indeed talked about how people analytics is needed to take massive amounts of data generated before, during, and after the recruiting process and turn it into actionable information. And he was talking more in terms of recruitment, but I think this translates to every step of the process. For recruitment specifically, we can think of using people analytics to drive with the data as we hire the best candidates possible for roles within our organization. So how do we know if a candidate is the best one for a given role, right? We can use people analytics to answer questions like, how long does it typically take to hire for a role? How diverse is our candidate slate? This gives us an idea of whether we are showcasing our job opportunities at the right place. And then finally, is there a conscious or unconscious bias in how we are hiring and who we are hiring? And this is critical because oftentimes there's a lot of bias that goes into all of the steps of the employee life cycle. And people analytics are really looking at data over time, looking at aggregate data can really help zone in or key in on the biases that may have been as a result of processes that have been used since forever. So with that, we'll come to why is it important to be inclusive and context driven. So Laszlo Bock, who was in 2015, he was SVP of People Operations at Google, and he really contributed a lot to using people analytics. He said that, don't trust your gut, use data to predict and shape the future. And I think advancements in AI and ML have allowed us to really extend the boundaries and capabilities of predictive analytics. But there's a widespread belief that algorithmic intelligence can really replace human intervention. And I'd like to contest that belief by saying that algorithmic intelligence should only augment human intervention and not really replace, because there's a lot of inherent biases that our algorithms and machines can bring in that won't serve well in the long run. So, like I was saying, our algorithms have bias, and this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone on this call. Everyone, all of us, mostly have an experience with AI. We have been in this space for a while. So, this really shouldn't be a huge stunner. There are a ton of resources out there which talk about how algorithms have bias, and talk about how acknowledging those bias is important, and how algorithms or data may not necessarily be objective. Like Melissa was pointing out, she said something, she said objective process. And it's very important to make sure that we're acknowledging our bias and making sure that the processes that we go through are less leaning towards subjective, um, or at least acknowledging, where your limitations are, where the machine is limited as well as where the humans are limited. Now, like I was saying, people analytics, if there is a lot of bias, if there is bias in our methods, in our outcomes, in how we look at the data and how we collect the data, this bias can lead to undesirable outcomes. And this includes discrimination, because sometimes so Sheng says something about this, reminds me some chapters of the book Weapons of Math Destruction, which including cases that use algorithms to help judges on sentencing criminals. Absolutely, and that is one of the books that I recommended. It's a great book, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that bias is around us everywhere. We have biases, we have our own biases. So really acknowledging all the biases can really help in the entire analytical process. So talking about biases and talking about people analytics, what ways may the pandemic have impacted your team or organization? Can you think of any ways in which your team, your organization may have been impacted, and you used maybe analytics or technology to overcome a challenge? Can you think of any way? So think of it in terms of what are some of the challenges that the pandemic has brought about. For example, in my organization, one of the big challenges was that our office locations closed down, right? And this was true for so many companies across the world. But almost overnight, our offices had to shut down and people were working remotely. So during this remote work, this time of working remotely for different individuals, we wanted to make sure that that the impact of working from home was like how were the productivity of employees working from home impacted as they continue to work from home. I think Chonan says something about adapting to working from home has been hard from some people. We have employees that have kids and newborns at home, and it's not been easy juggling. Absolutely, that is one of the key findings that we had from one of our analysis looking at employee data. we saw that employees were struggling with so many things. For example, they may not have had, reliable internet connections. They may not have had a second screen. They may be requiring certain pieces of technology that was only available to them in the offices, like, basic things like printers, access to a phone, access to a fax machine, for example. So making sure that we understood what the challenges of the employees were. And I'm just talking about challenges, for example, that impacted their work, in terms of how they function, but also the quality of their work. Like Chonan was saying, there are so many who are juggling newborns and they're juggling children. There was a lot of closures in the schools system. So really thinking about how everyone has their unique set of challenges and problems, and then using all of that data to make or give insights onto how the organization is functioning through the pandemic. So however, engineering team has seen its productivity shot up. And I've heard similar things from other tech companies. Absolutely, there have been so many of us within my organization who've talked about how there's no commute required, and that has really helped increase productivity or the time spent working on a project rather than commuting, just going to and from work, trying to find a parking spot, taking the train, walking through traffic, all those kind of things. So definitely it has been a different experience for different people, and the key has been within my organization to take all of the information that we had from our employees and then use it to understand what we could do as leadership to help the employees work better, or to really help support employees during this time. Um, and so what we did was we thought of people analytics in the current times through the pandemic as a function of voice, choice, and care. So voice being that we wanted to make sure that everyone within the organization had some say in the decision making. So for example, how comfortable people are returning to work or returning to the offices should be dependent on the employees and not with senior leadership, if that makes sense. Then choice. You want to make sure that all the employees are able to, not only voice their opinion, but are also given autonomy in making selections for themselves. And this is really helpful in people analytics because you get a sense of predicting what those choices may be. So for example, with the schools closing or the schools being remote, we could anticipate that the working parents within our groups would probably like to keep working from home, irrespective of whether or not the cities or states they work in have opened up. So that is an example of using predictive analytics to really think about what choices the employees may make beforehand and anticipating them. And finally, the care component. I think using people analytics, the baseline of using any kind of analytics on humans is to making sure that you're using the analytics for the benefit, for the good, or you're trying to emphasize that you care for the people within your organization. And that is something we have tried to do through the voice, choice, and care. And of course, like Hemant said in the beginning, it's an ongoing process. It always gets better and better, and we learn from our mistakes, and we try to make our practices more human, more people-centric. But the essence is that we try to enable voice, choice, and care. So now the final part of my presentation, I wanted it to be interactive. And I wanted to really brainstorm together as to how can we best use ML or AI in people analytics. And I say people analytics, but this is really broad. You can really think about this as any kind of analytics where the data is related to human beings, not just employees. It could be related to any human data that you're working on. Um, so what are some of the best practices in using ML or AI? So again, it's interactive. Put on your thinking hats and get ready to, type into chat. But what are some of the ways that you can reduce bias in the algorithms that you work on, or the algorithms that you develop, or even if you're using algorithms off the shelf, what are some of the ways that you can reduce bias? And to think of this question, let's look at the entire analysis process, right? So you're here, so it could be you, or it could be a team of researchers. And this is the data that you're looking at. So you remember the three kind of data that we talked about for people research, but this could be any data that you're using for your AI ML systems. Then the task that you're using the data for. So you're using this data to complete some kind of task. So maybe you're predicting turnover, maybe you are looking at what your existing composition is within the organizations. How many women are there, for example, in your teams? Maybe you're looking at who is getting hired and why are they getting hired. So those are the tasks that you're doing. And finally, you have the outcomes, wherein you're using the analytics or the insights from the analytics to recommend the way ahead. So you're looking at decision making, you're looking at data and using the data to drive outcomes, to drive change. So for example, within the hiring process, you can see that men are getting hired at a higher rate than women are. So what is the outcome from this data? How are you going to use that insight from your analytics and make the process better? Maybe one way could be you go back into the data and see, okay, so for all of the women who were not hired, what did their prior experience look like? What was their overall education looking like? Was it comparable to the men? Was it similar, or maybe did they decline the job? Maybe we need to post these jobs opportunities at different places where more women can apply. Is the candidate slate balanced? Those kind of things. So really using the insights from the tasks or the analysis to drive your outcomes, right? So let's look at each of these boxes. Do you think researchers contribute to algorithmic bias? Just type in yes or no. I see one yes. And others, are they undecided? I see Megan says no. And this is it's a trick question, right? When I say, do researchers contribute to algorithmic bias? Researchers inherently contribute to bias by selecting which algorithms to use. So although they may not contribute to the bias for a specific algorithm, they do contribute to bias in the overall process because they're deciding what questions to look at, what data to look at, how to clean the data, how to group the data, and then how to analyze the data set. And Heyman says depends on their knowledge. Absolutely. So, whether or not someone has context knowledge, whether or not someone doesn't have context knowledge, all that plays in to whether a researcher is contributing to bias or not. Again, looking at our data, how can our data be biased? And this is an easy question. I have all of the data types here, but how do you think our data can be biased? Think of the scenario in which you are working in an organization where you have a predominant group, where the predominant group is contributing to the data, right? And you want to make some decisions on hiring, or you want to make some decisions on, for example, what makes a great employee, what makes an efficient employee. You will see that the predominant group, or the data where you have most of your information coming from, is leading to biases within the data. So really, your data can be biased in several ways. I think within people analytics, at least, making sure that your data is not biased, or your data is related to the outcome or variable that you are looking to inspect, is very, very important. Melissa says, administering surveys about the telework experience in order to address problems, possible employee retention. Absolutely. Surveys are a great way to really understand what people are going through. And surveys, the best part about surveys is that it can have your quantitative data, but it could also have qualitative, open-ended type data sets, which you can use natural language processing and different toolboxes to really get insights from the open-ended set, to really know what the sentiment is among the people within your organization. Again, the tasks can be biased, and we've already talked a little bit about that. And the outcomes, obviously, how you use the data within an organization and how you use the insights to make change within an organization, it is biased based on who is making the decisions, who is part of the leadership team, or what the objectives or goals are or missions are for that organization. So with that, this was the general cycle of using data and getting outcomes or insight from the data. And you can see that I have some examples of biases that come in from different parts. So there's sampling bias, which could be coming in from the data type, or it could also be a function of the researcher and sampling, because the researcher is in charge of sampling the data. It could be measurement bias, exclusion bias. So many times we get rid of outliers, right? But there may be a very important question that outliers are posing, which the researcher may choose to ignore. So that is a huge bias that may be apparent in some data sets. And again, it could be due to an interaction between the researcher and the type of data that they're analyzing. So finally, we're almost at the end of our 45 minutes, but as you reflect and as you think about this session, I want you to be able to really recognize and describe people analytics. Again, it could really depend on whether it's a small team, large team. It's basically using insights to drive change for people working on a problem or a project together. So that's people analytics. If there's a takeaway that you need from this session, is that people analytics can extend to any circumstance and any team size, essentially. The second is that you understand that there's a need for inclusive and ethical, context-driven best practices. And then finally, we explored some applications of AI and ML to people analytics, and we talked about the entire process of how researchers interact with data, and then these data drive the tasks, and then the tasks can drive outcome or decision making based on the insights. So with that, feel free to type in any questions or ask me any questions. And I'm happy to connect on LinkedIn or Twitter or whichever your favorite connection or networking tool is. And I see, do we have any other answers? No. Okay. So yeah, feel free to type into the chat box and ask any questions that you may have, or feel free to reach out to me as well on LinkedIn or Twitter.
Thank you, Sreyoshi. So we did see some wonderful insights for people analytics from the audience. Like for example, him said the best way to use data is not just from employee or resume, but his or her social media like Facebook,
Absolutely.
Instagram, LinkedIn data as well. So
Absolutely.
and yeah, and audience also said, um, I have difficulties in convincing people that people analytics works, especially people from SMEs.
Right.
What's your thoughts about those?
I absolutely agree. Well, the first thing is that there is so much of data around us. We're living in a world where we are constantly contributing to data about us and, providing the world with our data. So, Hemant, while I agree that there is so much of data out there, like Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, we really want to be mindful and ethical in terms of what data we use for decision making, and make sure that the employees know that we are using what data the people are using. And in terms of really convincing people about people analytics, I think many people think about people analytics as machines taking over HR functions, or replacing human beings, replacing the expertise that humans bring in. And I think it's absolutely about convincing people that it's not about replacement; it's more about insights. And there are so many you know ways in which insights can be used within even small companies, for example. And it's just a question of working with the data, working with the outcomes, and making sure that you're able to show value in using analytics towards a given goal within an organization. Glenn says your website does not work. Well, it should work. I don't know why it's not working, but it should work. Just try typing in thatstatsgirl.com. Um, Anand says, do you have specific examples of bias that you have encountered? There are several. It really depends on what kind of data you're looking at, what kind of objectives you're looking to fulfill. Um, in one of the projects that I've worked on, and we were looking at teams, and we were looking at how performance within teams is evaluated. One of the things that we looked at was that the data showed that the women in that particular team were not functioning as well as the men, or were rather had a lower performance evaluation score than the men. And what we realized later through a focus group with that team was that, and this was consistent, over a couple of months, over a duration of a couple of quarters. And one of the things that we realized through a focus group with the team members was that the result of this score that we had for performance was a direct result of the metric used. And oftentimes you'll see that even companies like Amazon, for example, they have something called code review, which is essentially, you work on a code and then you send it to the manager, and then your manager sends it back to you. So the back and forth of, till you get the code right or working is used as a metric of how poorly you've performed in the coding task. And what there have been several research in this area that shows that often when a person on the team is closer to the manager, they would just maybe go show the code. So it's not like a documented process of looking at the code review. So that can create a lot of bias in the data. So even though the data seems accurate and fair, it may not be. So it's only a question of looking at insights and then going deeper down into the insights and really seeing, okay, this is what the data is telling me, but how do we know for sure that this is accurate? And how do we know for sure that it is a measure of performance? Melissa says, labeling a behavior as negative when it's culturally accepted behavior. Absolutely, Melissa. And that's absolutely a question of culture fit versus culture add. There are so many organizations that emphasize on culture fit, but it's also about culture add. And there may be people who are contributing to the culture and who may be different from the existing employees, and so really focusing on culture add more. And Glenn says, would you share your contact? And absolutely, I'll share my contact and my LinkedIn. I'll type it into the chat. So happy to connect with all of you there.
Okay, thank you, Sreyoshi, for your very interactive presentation and share your experiences and insights on people analytics. And thank you for all of the great questions and insights shared by the audience.